42 million Americans watched as Adam Schiff stepped into a chamber burning with tension. In seconds, Kash Patel's fury collided with one calm question about Epstein's black book. Silence cracked through Washington like thunder. What truth could turn raw power into fear before the entire nation? The red tally lights didn't just glow. They flared like sniper sights locking onto prey. The chamber didn't breathe. It held its breath, 1,000 lungs waiting to exhale. It wasn't politics anymore. It was a live reckoning, truth or deceit, broadcast to tens of millions. Adam Schiff entered like a blade sliding into velvet, calm, deliberate, merciless beneath the surface. His steps echoed like verdicts already written. He didn't smile, didn't blink. He didn't need to. His very stillness screamed that he wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to expose them. Across the table, Kash Patel sat armored in denial, yet cracked at the edges. His shoulders stiff, his jaw grinding, his pen trembling just once before clattering silently against his folder. He looked less like a director of power, more like a defendant waiting for a sentence he already knew was coming. The lights bleached the chamber until the desks looked like altars. Reporters bent over laptops, fingers twitching to strike the moment that would ignite headlines. A CNN producer mouthed, "Hold on his face." A Fox anchor whispered, "Wait for Patel's swing." The room was rigged like a powder keg, the match dangling inches from the flame. Schiff laid down a single notepad, aligning it perfectly with the desk edge, an executioner arranging his tools. His eyes rose, cold, sharp, inevitable. Patel froze, sweat sliding into his collar. The press gallery leaned forward, pens poised like daggers. "This is not just a hearing," one journalist muttered into a hot mic. "This is a trial of trust." Wait. And in that second, with red lights pulsing, microphones humming, and two men locked in silence, the entire nation felt it. The truth wasn't waiting to be spoken. It was waiting to explode. The first question landed like a hammer on steel. Schiff didn't warm up, didn't circle. He struck straight at the artery. "Did you terminate any FBI employee for working on Trump or January 6th? The words cracked across the chamber, sharp enough to slice through the marble air. Patel leaned back, his lips pressing into a thin line before the practiced phrase slipped out. "No one has ever been terminated for case assignments alone." The word alone slithered into the room, hanging there like smoke. Schiff caught it instantly, his eyes narrowing. Not a blink missed. "Alone?" Schiff's voice sharpened, cutting the air. "So in part? Were they fired in part because of those cases?" The repetition was surgical, relentless, a prosecutor's blade turning inside the wound. Patel shifted, fumbling with the pen that had already betrayed his nerves. His jaw moved, but the answers grew thinner, more brittle, like glass under pressure. The audience leaned forward as if pulled by invisible wires. In bars across Ohio, in living rooms across Texas, in church halls in Georgia, Americans stopped mid-breath. The chamber wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a prize fight under blinding lights. Schiff's calm was the jab that never tired. Patel's evasions were the desperate blocks of a fighter already pinned against the ropes. Schiff pressed again. No wasted motion. "Yes or no, were agents punished for working on Trump or January 6th? The silence after the question wasn't quiet. It was deafening. Patel's lips parted, but hesitation swallowed his words whole. Cameras zoomed tighter, amplifying every twitch. And in that silence, America realized something chilling. Sometimes the loudest confession isn't spoken. It's hidden in the word alone. Schiff didn't pause to savor Patel's stumble. He pivoted like a blade turning toward its next mark. "Let's talk about what's been referred to as Epstein's black book," he said, his voice steady, almost casual. But the chamber reacted as if a grenade had been dropped on the table. Reporters jolted upright, pens scratching like gunfire. Patel blinked, the first real crack in his armor. His answer came rushed, uneven. "My understanding is that materials often referred to as a black book have been in FBI custody." The words hung for a heartbeat before he tried to stuff them back with legalese. "What people call the black book has circulated publicly in parts for years." He added quickly the phrase, what is known as dripping with ambiguity. Schiff tilted his head, not moving, not blinking, letting the contradiction bleed in silence. On the screens of millions, the Chiron exploded. Breaking. Patel indicates FBI had custody of records referred to as a black book. In kitchens, gas. In diners, forks froze midair. Hashtags sparked online, racing through timelines like wildfire. The book was no longer a rumor, it was in play, in the hearing, on live TV. Patel swallowed, voice tight. It's been handled, appropriately. But the words fell flat. Schiff leaned in just enough for the cameras to catch the glint in his eye. He didn't need to shout. He let Patel's own admission detonate across the country. The silence after was heavier than any denial, heavier than the book itself. And in that silence, the question sharpened. If such a book exists in custody, what names and what decisions have kept it closed? When silence shatters under the weight of one question, how much darker does the truth become? This is a dramatized reconstruction for commentary. Details are fictionalized. Schiff let the last echo of Epstein's black book linger like smoke in the air before he struck again. His voice cut through the tension, crisp and surgical. Mr. Patel, you keep using the word alone. You said no one was terminated for case assignments alone, but words matter. Alone is not the same as in part. The sentence landed like a scalpel sliding under skin. Patel shifted, his face taut. He tried to hold steady, but Schiff wasn't just asking questions. He was dismantling language itself. So I'll ask you plainly, Schiff pressed, his tone sharper now, each syllable a nail being driven. Were agents removed in part because they worked on Trump or January 6th investigations? Yes or no? The repetition was relentless, the kind of prosecutorial grind that cracks even stone. Reporters leaned in, typing furiously. One headline flashed across a live blog. Semantics on trial, the word that shields the powerful. The chamber wasn't debating policy anymore. It was watching a word put under cross-examination, a single syllable standing as Patel's last line of defense. Patel gripped the pen tighter, his knuckles bleaching white. I said, no one was terminated for case assignments alone, he repeated, slower this time, like he believed stretching the word would somehow give it armor. But Schiff didn't flinch. He tilted forward, eyes narrowing, and delivered the blow. So then in part, they were. That's what you're telling this committee. The silence after the phrase hit harder than shouting ever could. Millions watching at home understood instantly. In workplaces, in schools, in offices across America, people had heard this trick before. Employers saying, not solely or not exclusively, as they quietly punish someone. Schiff wasn't just exposing Patel. He was exposing a system. And in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear. When power hides behind a single word, it isn't just language on trial, it's democracy itself. The chamber was silent, but across America, millions were already speaking. Schiff's dismantling of Patel's word games echoed in kitchens, classrooms, break rooms, and church basements. For ordinary citizens, this wasn't abstract. It was painfully familiar. They had all lived through the tyranny of carefully chosen words, the kind that twist justice into smoke. In Detroit, a black veteran sat forward in his worn recliner, fists tight on the armrest. He remembered when his promotion was denied, not for poor performance, but for not being the right cultural fit. It was the same trick, the same shield. He muttered to the screen, "That's exactly how they did it to me." In Phoenix, a teacher still holding a half-graded stack of papers watched with red-rimmed eyes. Years ago, she had been pushed out of her school, not for incompetence, but for alignment issues with administrative goals. She could hear Patel's voice in her principal's words. Schiff's cross-examination wasn't about the FBI anymore. It was about her. In a diner outside Atlanta, a waitress leaned against the counter, phone propped on a sugar jar. She'd been cut from the schedule last year after joining a union drive. The official note said, "Business adjustments." She laughed bitterly at Patel's repetition of alone, shaking her head. "Yeah, adjustments. Same damn lie, different suit." Schiff's voice filled the hearing, but it carried further than the marble chamber. Words like alone are not accidents. They are shields for the guilty. They are designed to blur responsibility. to bury motive in smoke. The line wasn't just for Patel, it was for every American who had ever been erased by bureaucratic language. Reporters scrambled to capture it. Headlines flared. Schiff turns questioning into a voice for the silenced. And for those watching, the pattern was undeniable. Patel's evasion wasn't just his. It was the echo of every institution that hides behind semantics while destroying lives. In that instant, America recognized itself in the hearing. This wasn't only a fight over FBI firings, it was a mirror. And what stared back was the unsettling truth. When power rewrites language, it rewrites people's lives. The wordplay had cornered him, and Patel felt the walls closing in. His answers were no longer calm denials but jagged fragments, stitched together with panic. Finally, he snapped. His voice cracked like a whip. "You're setting traps, Mr. Schiff. This isn't oversight, it's entrapment." The outburst ricocheted through the chamber, bouncing off marble like gunfire. Reporters jerked their heads up, pens frozen mid-sentence. Camera operators zoomed in, seizing the moment like predators closing on prey. For millions watching at home, Patel's fury didn't look like strength. It looked like fear bleeding through rage, the carefully polished image of a senior power operative fractured in real time, shards of anger cutting his own credibility apart. Schiff did not move. He did not raise his voice, did not flinch. He sat still, eyes locked, expression as cold as a verdict already written. His silence roared louder than Patel's shouting, making the contrast impossible to ignore. Patel was fire burning out of control. Schiff was stone, immovable, unyielding. The nation held its breath. In living rooms, viewers leaned closer, stunned by the reversal. A man exploding on live TV versus a man unmoved. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was an image war. And in that war, Schiff's composure became a weapon sharper than any question. Within seconds, headlines raced across the digital crawl. Patel rattled, Schiff unmoved. Clips flooded social media, slowed down, looped endlessly. Patel's mouth twisted in anger against Schiff's frozen calm. Memes sprouted instantly. One man red-faced, another still as ice. The public didn't need an analyst to tell them who looked like the adult in the room. And Schiff, still silent, let the noise bury Patel. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply let the eruption consume itself. Because Schiff knew the truth. In the theater of power, sometimes the most devastating strike is not what you say, but what you refuse to say. If one word can shield the powerful, what else has been hidden in plain sight? The chamber had barely cooled from Patel's explosion when Schiff leaned forward and dropped the next blade. His tone was even, almost calm, but the words cut deeper than any shout. "You've boasted about releasing 33,000 pages, Mr. Patel. 33,000. He paused, letting the number echo like a drumbeat through the chamber. But a mountain of paper is not the same as justice. It is smoke, and behind that smoke, the truth suffocates. The gallery stirred. Reporters typed furiously, their screens lighting up with headlines. 33,000 pages, but no justice. The number, once meant to overwhelm and impress, suddenly looked sinister. A wall of paper hiding what mattered most. Schiff's eyes never left Patel. "Quantity isn't transparency," he pressed. "What good are thousands of pages if what matters is buried under thousands of redactions?" Outside the chamber, the montage unfolded across America. Survivors of Epstein's web, faces blurred on news broadcasts, spoke through trembling voices. One woman in New York stared at the screen, whispering, 33,000 pages, and still not one name held accountable. A man in Florida, his hands shaking, told a reporter, "They think we'll be impressed by the number, but we see it for what it is, silence dressed as evidence." In a Houston living room, a mother who had followed every headline turned to her daughter and said, "They're playing with numbers because they're afraid of names." Across the nation, in bars, schools, and union halls, people muttered the same realization. The paper meant nothing if the ink was designed to hide. Patel tried to regain control. "Transparency requires balance," he said, his voice thin, as if the phrase itself was borrowed. But Schiff didn't blink. "Balance? Tell that to the victims who have waited decades for accountability. Balance doesn't heal scars. Balance doesn't put predators behind bars. His voice dropped lower, colder. Balance doesn't mean truth. It means delay. The tension pressed down until the room itself seemed smaller, tighter, as if the marble walls had heard enough. Schiff let the silence stretch again, this time not to break Patel, but to give weight to the words already spoken. The cameras captured everything: his stillness, Patel's unease, and a number that no longer looked impressive, but monstrous. And in that moment, 33,000 didn't sound like progress. It sounded like a tombstone for justice never delivered. The air was still vibrating from the weight of those 33,000 pages when Schiff struck again, pivoting sharply like a prosecutor who just found the weakness in a witness's story. His voice dropped into a tone colder than the marble walls themselves. "Mr. Patel," he said, "let's talk about Ghislaine Maxwell. Why was she transferred to a lower security facility immediately after cooperating with investigators?" The chamber rippled with gasps. Every reporter knew the name. Every camera zoomed in tighter. Every American watching felt the hairs on their arms rise. Patel's lips tightened, his voice quick to deflect. "That decision was made by the Bureau of Prisons," he replied, rehearsed and flat, as though those words could build a wall high enough to protect him. But Schiff leaned forward, eyes narrowing like a hawk diving for the kill. "By the Bureau of Prisons?" he repeated. "But who told them? Who gave the order?" Silence stretched again, heavier this time, as if the entire chamber understood that this was the fracture line, the place where excuses couldn't hold. Patel shifted, his collar damp, his words stumbling into jargon. "Administrative protocols, standard transfers, routine." But the excuses didn't land. They scattered, brittle and hollow. Schiff cut him off. "Routine? You call it routine when a woman at the center of the most notorious sex trafficking scandal of our time is moved to comfort the very day she talks to investigators? That doesn't read as routine, Mr. Patel. It reads like orchestration." The words hit like hammer blows, and the gallery erupted in a low, stunned murmur. Breaking headlines raced across every news ticker. The transfer that raises more questions than answers. Social media erupted with hashtags, "Who told them?" and "Maxwell." My story climbed into trending within minutes. Survivors watching at home clenched their fists, their voices hoarse from shouting at the screens. For them, it wasn't politics, it was personal. Schiff wasn't just speaking to Patel, he was speaking to every victim who had ever been betrayed by institutions claiming protocol. Patel tried again, but his voice faltered. Schiff sat back, his silence cutting sharper than any question. And in that silence, the chamber felt less like a hearing and more like a crime scene, waiting for the evidence that someone in power prayed would never see daylight. The heat of accusation finally boiled over, and Patel's mask cracked wide. His fist struck the table, his voice erupting like a gunshot. "You're a liar, Mr. Schiff! A disgrace!" The words ripped across the chamber, sharp, jagged, uncontrolled. Reporters jolted, pens freezing midair. Cameramen snapped their lenses tighter, capturing Patel's face twisted in fury. The outburst echoed, but it wasn't power. It was desperation bleeding into rage. Millions at home watched, stunned, not by Schiff's silence, but by Patel's unraveling on live television. And Schiff? He didn't move. He didn't blink. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly, his gaze fixed on Patel with the calm of a man who had already won. The silence was glacial, creeping into every corner of the chamber until it felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The power shifted without a word spoken. For 30 seconds, the most important man in the room was the one who refused to speak. Patel's rant hung in the air, flailing for ground, but it collapsed under the weight of Schiff's stillness. The audience knew it, the reporters knew it, and Patel himself felt it. Every syllable of his anger had made him smaller. Schiff's silence had made him monumental. Commentators whispered urgently into lev mics. In that silence, one said, power shifted. Another voice on cable news murmured, "We are watching Patel implode, and Schiff doesn't even need to answer." Headlines began to form before the gavel even struck. Patel rattled, Schiff unmoved. Across the country, people in bars, kitchens, and offices saw the moment for what it was. This wasn't just a man losing his temper. It was the collapse of authority under the weight of composure. Schiff had turned silence into a weapon sharper than Patel's rage, and America felt the tremor of that reversal. The chamber sat frozen, ice settling over the marble, the air thick with the gravity of what had just unfolded. Schiff didn't need to respond. He had already spoken in the most devastating way possible, by saying nothing. Can a single book of names drag the nation's conscience into the light? The silence of the chamber didn't stay contained within marble walls. It spilled outward, carried on live feeds, amplified by tickers and breaking banners until it seeped into every corner of America. Bars, church halls, and living rooms became satellites of the hearing, each screen glowing like a courtroom window. The whole nation was watching, leaning forward, holding its breath, waiting for what might come next. In a smoky bar outside Cleveland, a crowd of veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, beer bottles untouched. One of them, a man with a faded Marine tattoo, slammed his fist softly against the counter. "I fought for truth," he said, his voice low, bitter, eyes fixed on Schiff's frozen stare. "So why is it buried in paperwork and lies?" The others nodded, their silence heavier than the bottles in their hands. Inside a church hall in Birmingham, congregants gathered around a single television, folding chairs creaking as bodies leaned closer. The pastor, still in his robe, whispered as the feed replayed Patel's outburst and Schiff's stillness. "This is David and Goliath," he said, "but the stone is silence." The crowd murmured back as if it were scripture. In a kitchen in Phoenix, a teacher wiped her hands on a dish towel and stood frozen, her daughter beside her. The word alone replayed in her head like a bad dream. She muttered almost to herself, "That's how they erased me. That's the same word." Her daughter looked up, confused but curious, as if realizing for the first time that politics wasn't distant, it was personal. And in a diner in Atlanta, a waitress leaned against the counter, her phone propped up against a ketchup bottle. The headline blazed across her screen. Patel rattled, Schiff unmoved. She laughed, shaking her head. "About time someone made them sweat," she said, her voice rising enough for customers to nod in agreement. From coast to coast, America wasn't just watching. It was absorbing, interpreting, reliving its own stories through the clash of two men in a chamber. And as the images flickered, bars, church halls, kitchens, the nation seemed to ask itself the same question. If truth can be cornered on live television, how many times has it been buried where no camera could see? The images of America watching rolled like a tide, and in that tide, Schiff's figure began to shift. He wasn't just the man drilling Patel with questions. He was something larger, a vessel for every voice that had been silenced by systems too powerful to fight. As reporters dug into his past, headlines reminded viewers of the battles he had already fought. The young prosecutor who once stood up for immigrant families in Los Angeles. The congressman who took on cases of racial profiling when others looked away. The lawmaker who marched beside workers demanding fair wages. For those who remembered, this wasn't a new role. Schiff had always carried the posture of a man speaking not just for himself, but for those who never had the microphone. Every question he fired at Patel echoed like a translation of older fights. Against landlords who hid behind contracts, against officials who hid behind vague policies, against managers who buried firings under the word alone. Cable news commentators framed it live, their voices urgent over the footage. "Schiff isn't just cross-examining Patel," one anchor declared. "He's defending the unheard." The phrase crawled across the chyron, bold and unmissable, as images of Schiff's earlier career played side by side with Patel's stammering replies. It wasn't just confrontation, it was contrast. One man sweating behind words, the other standing as the spine of people long forgotten. In a union hall in Chicago, workers gathered after their shift, watching Schiff press for answers. One welder leaned forward, grease still on his hands, whispering, "He's asking what we've been asking our bosses for years. Who gave the order? Who decided we weren't worth the truth?" Across town, an immigrant mother watching on her cracked tablet screen wept quietly. "At least one of them remembers us," she said. The hearing had become more than oversight. It had become a referendum on whether the voices pushed to the margins could still find a champion in the halls of power. And as Schiff's words struck, relentless and measured, The question no longer sounded like it belonged only to the FBI. It belonged to every worker, every family, every citizen who had ever been told their pain was procedural. The chamber no longer looked like a hearing room. It looked like an arena, and in that arena, two figures stood in stark opposition. Patel, red-faced and restless, swinging his words like wild punches, and Schiff, unmoving, his weapon not fury but precision, each question sharpened to a blade. He didn't shout, didn't flail. He struck with stillness, with logic, with patience that burned hotter than fire. Every time Patel's voice rose, his authority shrank. His anger made him smaller, while Schiff's composure made him immense. It was the paradox of power. The man who screamed seemed weak, and the man who whispered became a warrior. His silence was not retreat, it was strategy. His stare wasn't passive, it was the steady aim of a marksman. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. One headline formed before the words even hit the wire. The calm that cut deeper than fury. Another anchor on live TV murmured, "Schiff looks like a general on the battlefield. He doesn't need to swing, he waits for his opponent to collapse under his own weight." And collapse was exactly what Patel seemed to be doing, every outburst feeding Schiff's quiet strength. In homes across America, people recognized the image instantly. This wasn't a politician dodging questions or grandstanding for cameras. This was something older, almost primal. The picture of a warrior who had traded armor and sword for words and silence. Schiff's voice became a shield, his restraint a spear, his presence a battlefield, where one man's fury kept breaking against the wall of another man's calm. As the camera zoomed tight on his face, America saw more than a congressman pressing an official. They saw a warrior in the truest sense, fighting not for himself, but for the people who had been silenced, ignored, erased. And in that moment, the question looming over the chamber felt larger than the men seated there. It wasn't just about Patel's answers. It was about who truly stood trial, a man or the system that protected him. When the nation itself takes the stand, who will be found guilty? One man or the system? The chamber was already raw from hours of blows, but Schiff wasn't finished. He leaned into the microphone, his voice lower now, heavier, every syllable meant to etch itself into stone. "Oversight isn't theater," he said, pausing long enough for the silence to stretch, for Patel to shift in his seat. "It's survival for democracy." The words didn't fall, they detonated. On television screens across the country, the line flared across the crawl in bold. The quote that defined the hearing. Anchors repeated it within seconds, their voices trembling with the weight of a phrase destined to outlive the moment. In newsrooms, producers mouthed it as if it were scripture. And in living rooms, bars, and union halls, Americans sat up straighter, some whispering the words aloud as though testing their power. Patel blinked hard, but his fury couldn't find footing anymore. Schiff's declaration had stripped the stage of all pretense. This wasn't performance, wasn't grandstanding. It was a warning, carved sharp enough to pierce history itself. Reporters tweeted it before Patel could even form a rebuttal. The internet flooded with clips, edited, replayed, looped endlessly. And Schiff didn't smile, didn't savor. He simply sat back, letting the silence again press like a verdict over the chamber. Because the truth of that moment was undeniable. One man had shouted, one man had dodged, but only one line would remain etched into the record, carried forward as both shield and blade. "Oversight or theater?" Schiff had answered, not with spectacle, but with a truth so cold, so unflinching, that the chamber itself seemed to bow under its weight. And for a nation gasping for something solid, his words became more than a soundbite. They became a lifeline. The moment Schiff's words hit the airwaves, they didn't just stay inside the chamber. They detonated outward, a shockwave tearing through the country. Survivors of Epstein's empire began speaking up, their voices carried on television interviews, podcasts, and live streams. A woman in Miami, face blurred for safety, stared into the camera and said, "We were told justice would come. Instead, we see paper, excuses, transfers." Schiff is right. This isn't theater. It's our lives. Her words burned across social feeds, shared millions of times. Hashtags surged like wildfire. The book speaks, truth not theater, who told them? Within hours, they trended at the top, drowning out celebrity gossip and campaign ads. Each post added fuel: photos of redacted pages, screenshots of Patel's outbursts, clips of Schiff's silence. The digital noise became a roar, impossible for Washington to ignore. On Capitol Hill, the ripple reached even unlikely shores. A senior Republican senator told reporters, "These questions can't be brushed aside. An inspector general review is warranted." Moments later, a Democrat echoed him, calling for a bipartisan review, calling for bipartisan oversight. For one rare beat, the partisan walls trembled. Schiff had forced something no one expected: the crack of consensus. Cable banners captured it instantly. The questions that cannot be buried. And anchors replayed Patel's stammer, Schiff's blade-like precision, and the quote that now defined the hearing. In union halls, veterans' posts, church basements, people watched not just for spectacle, but because it felt like history bending in real time. And Patel? His denials now sounded smaller, like whispers drowned by a rising tide. The country wasn't asking politely anymore. It was demanding justice, answers, accountability. Because Schiff's words had left a scar on the national conscience, and scars demand to be seen. The chamber seemed to shrink into itself as Schiff leaned closer to the microphone. He no longer looked at Patel. He looked straight into the camera, into the millions of eyes waiting on the other side of the screen. His voice was steady, unshaken, etched with the gravity of a man who knew this was more than politics. "Justice isn't charity," he said, each word a strike against the silence. "It's survival, and it belongs to all of us." The nation saw it, felt it, absorbed it. A montage unfolded across America as though the cameras had turned outward. A veteran in Ohio sat taller in his chair, his medals glinting in the TV glow as he whispered, "That's what I fought for." A teacher in Detroit, chalk dust still on her sleeves, nodded with tears in her eyes. Her classroom might not have money for books, but for a moment she felt seen. A single mother in Texas shut off her late-night shift alarm, staring at Schiff's face, murmuring, "Finally, someone said it plain." The images stitched together into something bigger than the hearing. It wasn't Schiff versus Patel anymore. It was the people versus the silence that had buried them for decades. On social media, the quote became a rallying cry, printed on posters, shouted in protests, pinned to digital feeds. News anchors replayed it again and again, calling it the moment America stopped watching and started listening. Schiff didn't smile, didn't claim victory. He let the silence linger after his words, a silence heavier than any gavel. And in that silence, a question grew, one that refused to stay trapped in the chamber, one that reached every living room, every diner, every church hall. Whose silence protects power, and whose voice will break it? When silence protects injustice, will America dare to demand the answers it deserves? Justice is never a gift. It is survival, and it must be claimed through courage and persistence. The voices of the powerless only matter when someone dares to bring them into the light. In our daily lives, we all face moments of injustice, excuses, or vague words meant to hide the truth. In those moments, silence means complicity, while speaking up plants the seed of change. So will you choose silence for temporary safety, or raise your voice to protect truth and justice for everyone? Justice is not won in whispers. It is forged in the open, under the weight of tough questions and unshakable courage. And every silence we break brings us closer to the truth America deserves. If this story resonated with you, don't let it fade. Hit subscribe, like, and share so more voices can join this fight for accountability. Stay with us, because the story doesn't end here. This dramatized story is created for inspiration, education, and reflection. It does not represent any single individual or institution. Viewer discussion and interpretation are encouraged. Your perspective matters. Now I want to hear from you. When power hides behind silence, what do you believe is our greatest weapon? Relentless truth, unshakable courage, or the strength of unity? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading everyone.